Hello everyone, it's Ren here speaking. I hope you are well, guys. You might be a little bit surprised to see me here today, as I have been, well, as announced a few weeks ago that I'd be focusing my production of videos on Sundays, but I have been otherwise inspired today. So here I am, and I hope you will be here with me. We'll have to see. So before I start this video, just keep in mind that my book, The Ecstatic Soul on the INFJ type, is still available. Links are down below if you want the deepest investigation into the type ever conducted. And it's doing really well. It's getting near 1,000 copies sold, so very pleased with it. It's also a very nice product, so bit of advertising right here. Look at this. It's lovely. Right. You might also have noticed that I've decided to attempt looking at the actual camera lens instead of looking in this direction like I used to. It's been mentioned in the comments before that it can be a little bit, maybe this angle brings me closer to the audience. I have to get used to it, and it's quite possible that at certain points I will be weirdly just shifting back to this mode. And if it happens in fits and starts, you know, don't be too shocked with it, because I just have to get used to it, basically. Okay, so let's maybe start with our video today. I want to discuss cognitive typology, or cognitive type. A lot of people online, maybe not enough people, but a lot of people online are more familiar with it under the name of voltology, which is in fact only one of its components, the components that focuses on the level of the body, micro expressions, things like that. And there are people who are hesitant about it. There are some people who are very enthusiastic about it. Having engaged with the theory a little bit more over the last few weeks and months, I wanted to release a video where I discuss cognitive typology a little bit more in detail. And perhaps partly because I think that my audience, among whom I would suspect there are people who find the premise preposterous, according to which essentially your cognitive functions, your use of certain cognitive functions in a certain hierarchy, which yields your type, is reflected in a manner of embodied cognition in the way your face moves, the facial and body signals that you manifest, and that your type essentially can be mapped through the careful and rigorous and systematic observation and collection of information on your signals. So, I mean, I think there's a number of reasons why the CT, as we can refer to it, cognitive typology, is polarizing, if you can call it that, because it seems that it's you rarely encounter someone, as far as my experience goes, it seems you rarely encounter someone who is neutral about it. Either have people who think that this is the greatest thing that has ever been conceived since young in the domain of typology, and then you have people who are, I think, dismissive of it as being something that just doesn't hold up, because well, there's something very uncomfortable in the idea that you could be seen purely in terms of what you manifest in your signals, partly because it's very, very difficult to not be yourself in your signals. There's no direct conscious control, so in essence, it would appear as if the expert voltologist was a kind of god, that they were able to know you better than you know yourself, because they're able to pierce through what are supposed to be your subjective biases, the darkness that surrounds your awareness and consciousness to get to the truth. And yeah, of course, in some sense, that's uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable for some people. But if the pursuit is the truth, perhaps it's worth exploring. And I think that partly what I have found attractive about this particular approach is that it really seems to be interested in the truth. Now, the truth is something else than the theory. You know, you always need to keep this in mind. You can have a theory of that's as powerful as you want. It's never going to be synonymous with the truth. You know, there's a French astrophysicist, Aurélien Barraud, whom I have been following for a few years at this point, who likes to say in a somewhat provocative manner, scientific theories are never true. They're always false. His point is not to say that all scientific theories are useless. I mean, that's something that we don't want to say. But I think his point is to say that the best that you can hope when it comes to a theory, which is produced by a localized collection of human subjects, each possessing human knowledge articulated around finitude. No one is omniscient like God is, if there is a God. Well, by definition, a theory cannot be synonymous with the truth, but it can aim for a maximal degree of corroboration. In other words, you know, Karl Popper says, philosopher of science says, theory is true until proven false. And that's another way of looking at it. So I think that it's more useful to think about theories in terms of their degree of corroboration rather than whether they completely capture the truth. But certainly, if a theory is to be far-reaching and to have a degree of corroboration, and to aim for a high degree of corroboration and to be influential and maybe impact the way that a particular discipline is conducted in the future, it needs to be aiming towards the truth, even if the truth is never completely captured, because the truth is by definition transcendent, whereas human knowledge and human attainment, even the best theories, are always going to be immanent to the particular situation in which they are invented. And I think that from this perspective, CT is genuinely interested in the truth. You can partly see this in the way in which, contrary to maybe things like objective personality, which is a system that has good things about it too, by the way, and, you know, the C.S. Joseph system, which maybe has fewer things that are good about it. Unlike those two, CT doesn't market itself very well. I mean, when you think about it, it's not the best known theory. And the channel, the Cognitive Typology channel, which I will link below, and I really encourage you to subscribe to it and to check out the videos that Auburn has been releasing recently. Auburn is the main brain behind CT. Because I think that what you'll realize is that the quality of the material is proportionally completely inverse to the level of exposure that the channel has. It only has maybe 2,000 subscribers and the videos rarely exceed 1,000 views. I think this is like, in terms of a ratio that is so tiny in terms of number of views to quality of the content offered and how thought through it is. I mean, that has to be one of the number one on YouTube, I think. And I think it's partly, and maybe I stand to be corrected by people who are going to comment, I think this could be partly because the creators and the articulators of CT are so interested in creating a good, falsifiable, respectable scientific model, and are so interested in the pursuit of the truth, that they are maybe not neglecting the marketing aspect, the aspect of trying to make sure that CT is as visible on the internet as possible, but certainly not considering it a priority. They might think in some part of their mind that it is a priority, but I think as it stands, there must be a reason. I mean, the website looks great, there's a wiki that's great and everything, but there must be a reason why it's not as well known and not as ubiquitous as things like C.S. Joseph and objective personality, because it's probably the best of the three. And I mean, again, this is only a conjecture, but I think that, you know, it is a theory that has an interest in the truth, and it has a lot of really interesting things to say. And even for that reason, keeping in mind that you don't have to be worried if CT considers your type to be not what you consider it to be in MBTI terms, always remember, models are to be, or theories are to be distinguished by their degree of corroboration. If they're scientific, this is something you can establish. They're not necessarily mutually translatable. So you can be of a certain type in one model and a different type in another model. Ideally, you'd have a unification at some point, but this is not going to happen anytime soon. So you don't need to fret. You know, you don't need to fret. And it's very, very worth looking more into the theory. So it's already been 11 minutes. So I will kind of spend the next 10, 15 minutes looking at some notes I have here. And I mean, I'm not going to read the notes. It's only like little kind of bullet points, so I know what I want to discuss. So the first, these are like what I've just been talking about here are just like preliminary remarks. So now I'm going to move to a brief discussion of some strengths that I perceive in CT, and updated by recent exchanges with Auburn, with Discord community there, by looking at the wiki, which is enormous, full of very dense, very tightly structured information about the different aspects of the theory. It's another nice aspect of it, by the way. It's very open access, open to criticism for this reason, you understand. Okay, so first strength, simplicity, easy to understand. You look at CT, if you spend a couple hours exploring the website, watching Auburn's videos, I think the best thing to do is to watch Auburn's videos, you know, especially the ones that he's been starting to release. The ones that date to 2022 are a good start. You see, it's quite easy to understand. There's no weird hypothesis inserted there. The language is not unclear. It works with a certain relatively small number of variables, you know, that are all related to embodied cognition. And once you have those variables in mind, you can start looking at how the theory operates and how, you know, people practice observation on the basis of the theory precepts. So it's simple. That's nice when it comes to a scientific theory, okay? It's usually seen as a strength. When you have something that's very complicated, that involves lots of different particular types of the superego and the id and whatever, you know, when you have a lot of stuff going on and it's complicated to understand, it's usually a sign, it's usually a bad sign, essentially. Second strength, well, it's falsifiable. That's a criterion that for our friend Popper, Karl Popper, makes the theory scientific. Now, of course, we don't have to agree with Popper that the criterion is a satisfying one, and it's been discussed in the philosophy of science for a long time. It's not an ideal criterion. But nevertheless, the fact that a scientific theory is falsifiable should be seen to be a kind of minimum. You know, if you have a theory that's unfalsifiable, we have a big problem. Falsifiable does not mean falsified. In other words, if you have a very, very high degree of corroboration, the theory might not be falsified for a very long time, as long as it's intrinsically, internally structured and presented in such a way as to be falsifiable. In this case, it's quite simple. Theory says, for example, that the theory predicts that a person who manifests certain signals is going to be, so let's say NIFE signals, all right, which would correlate, broadly speaking, with INFJ in the MBTI framework. It predicts that that person will have certain particular areas of interest, particular dispositions, a particular psychology. Psychology is the word that CT uses a lot in this case. So the theory makes predictions between what's observed, the micro-expressions, the signals, the various signals, and the psychology. So it's very much open to falsification, because they could come across someone who has all the signals that ought to indicate a particular psychology, and they get something else. So an SIFE, ISFJ, and you know, etc. That maybe shows areas of interest in the mystical, you know, things like that, or NIFE showing areas of interest that would be more associated with someone who's very practical, you know, centered, who doesn't particularly have any attraction for the mystical or the abstract. So it's falsifiable in this sense, and that's a good thing. Now, third strength is parsimonious. That's another quality you want to have in the scientific theory. In other words, it's ontologically, I'll explain this in a second, it's ontologically sparse. You don't want to have a theory that has an ontology that is very, very full of different types of objects, substances, and things like that. An ontology is basically the category of what is. So in philosophy, or not just in philosophy, in science too, an ontology would be basically what a theory includes as possible and actual objects in its worldview. And I would say that CT has a fairly sparse and parsimonious ontology that does not multiply objects and categories of objects beyond what's necessary, because it is materialistic. So one of the reasons why CT is polarizing, in the sense that it is, it seems to be very much focused on what's observable physically, the physical, in other words, the physical. It doesn't appeal to certain people who are very attached to the domains of the unconscious, domains of the archetypes, domains of the symbols, right? So CT doesn't really care about that. Now, people who are interested in CT, people who have created CT might be very interested in this topic, but from the perspective of the theory, these concepts, as far as I understand, are neutral. They're equal to zero, if you like. They don't play any role. They don't play any explanatory role. What matters is this physical aspect, at least when it comes to observation, where you can make observation experiments, confirm, invalidate, and so on. It's a materialist ontology, in other words, it's a physicalist ontology, which means by definition that it doesn't multiply beyond what can be observed. It's usually when a system is very abstract that ontologies tend to become very, very overstuffed and overfed, because by definition, if something is abstract, something is unconscious, well, the theorist is more or less free to multiply, you know, the domain of objects and the kinds of objects that are to be included to their heart's content. There's no limit. If you're limited by the physical, then you're sparse. So that's a very good aspect of it too. Fourthly, it's open to criticism, disagreements, and updates to the theory. So this is something that people might not necessarily realize when they first encounter Voltology online. Again, I'm saying Voltology because it seems to me that people who have more or less heard of what's going on here, they'd be more likely to be familiar with the word Voltology than cognitive typology, which is the underlying and four-sided theory of which Voltology is only a part, one of four different integrated parts. Partly because online you have a lot of people, or some people, who practice, as they claim, Voltology, and they don't seem to be as open. They seem to be less open than would be ideally wished for. And so maybe, you know, that's some bad marketing in a way, because it's not counteracting by this not good enough marketing by the real CT, if you like. So a lot of people are exposed to Voltologists that might not be recognized as, you know, certified Voltologists by CT. And as a result, they may not have a good experience. Whereas having consorted, at least for a while now, with the community in CT, it's a very open, very, I would say, on the more sort of cerebral side, very clearly interested in the theory, very open to discussion, very open to critique, and proof is that if the criticism is seen as legitimate, at least in its formulation, maybe not necessarily in what it has to say, you'll get a response, and a detailed response. So there's a real exchange going on here. And again, that's what you want. If you have an ongoing theory, it needs to engage with what people have to say. maybe not just anybody, but if a criticism or if an observation, a potential objection is formulated, you want to have it being addressed. It's a bit like what Wittgenstein said. You know, he said a philosopher who doesn't engage in debates is like a boxer who doesn't get into the ring. So if you remember that, I think CT gets into the ring, and I like that about it too. And the fifth and final strength that I will list for now, and for me personally, it's the most attractive strength, but it's probably a weakness from the point of view of some of the people who are a little bit uncomfortable with CT and what it proposes, because maybe they see it as all too physicalistic in some sense, is that it challenges our intuitions. Intuitions are fragile and unreliable things. Sometimes NI dominance can come to overestimate the reliability of intuition because they see intuition as their primary function. So from the point of view of cognitive dissonance, they don't want to live perpetually with this notion that they can't trust their intuitions. They'd be constantly in conflict with themselves. But intuitions are, the intuitions can be brilliant, but they can also be false. And we know that ordinary thinking is sometimes powerless to explain what's going on at the level of physical reality, full stop. Counterintuitive propositions are often the way to go in science when you want to push the envelope. I mean, Newton and his law of gravitation violated our intuitions. Einstein and his idea of his redefinition of gravity as the curving, as linked to the curving of space-time, even the idea that space could be curved violated our intuitions. Quantum physics, I don't even need to go into the detail of it. It still up to this day violates our intuitions, and that's what makes it so difficult to understand for a lot of people. These are dominant theories in cosmology and in physics. They violate our intuitions, and it was precisely because the people behind those theories were willing to violate our intuitions that they managed to get that far. So the fact that Voltology or that CT in general violate your intuitions about what type is, or not violate, but I should say replace all my mentions of violate and replace it with challenge. Challenges so deeply our intuitions seems so counterintuitive. It's not a good thing necessarily. Some counterintuitive things are completely stupid, but some counterintuitive things can be revolutionary because they push you to think beyond the limited perimeter of what you expect to be true. When you operate within that framework, things are secure, things are comfortable, but there's no progress. Okay, to progress beyond a certain stage, you need to be willing to challenge other people's intuitions. So you can have models of personality that comfort you in your intuitions. Maybe people will say, oh, it puts in words what I was never able to express like that. Now, that's good. But it's if it challenges you to look at type differently and to question whether you have the right idea of your type in the interest of truth, that's a good thing. And it takes some courage. So that's personally my favorite thing about it. Now, in terms of weaknesses, this video is starting to drag on, so I'll try to wrap it up in a few minutes. I have 3 weaknesses listed. I'll call it rather areas of improvement. I think it's a better way to put it. And it's a constantly improving, developing theory. So areas of improvement, from my perspective, is apt as a phrase. Number 1, the psychology dimension is, or at least seems, vague. So I know that there is a whole model of psychodynamics integrated within the cognitive type model. That's all very well, but based on what a lot of people are going to be accessing CT through, which is the videos on the channel, this idea that the Voltology strongly correlates in observation with psychology is all very well, and it's a really interesting, challenging notion. But I just find that the voltological dimension is described very precisely and very painstakingly. The psychological dimension seems to me, based on the videos, again, I'm not talking about maybe some articles in the wiki and the notes that are part of the operational nature of work on the theory on an everyday basis. I mean, I don't know about this, but also I'm thinking about people accessing CCT from the outside. It seems that psychology is either defined in terms of the Jungian definitions in Psychology of Types or the works of John Beebe, or defined in terms of like occupation or interest, areas of interests. I mean, that's something, but it doesn't go very deep into psychology itself, psychology of people itself, and some people might find it simplistic. At least that's the impression that it can give people, I think, that there is an excess of dominance of the voltology over the psychology in CT's model. And in a way this makes sense, because embodied cognition tends to start with the physical, as far as I understand. But if the aim is to bring people back eventually to the psychology, I think that a very tightly structured categorization of different psychologies would stand to benefit the framework overall. Now, the second area of improvements, I think, I mean, what I put there is CT truly falsifiable? I mean, in principle, it certainly is falsifiable, and I'm sure that it has been falsified. But because I'm not at the heart of this particular process, I mean, from the outside, what I observe is that, I mean, sure, okay, like it's falsifiable in principle, but what happens concretely if there is a case of falsification? So we take a particular person, they submit a video for analysis by a certified voltologist, and that person is identified, you know, there's a good report that's made, it's complete, and there's agreement this person is, again, I'm going to go back to, let's say, well, no, let's pick another one. Let's say FISE, okay? ISFP in MBTI terms. And it turns out that the person is like, in terms of their psychology, has the psychology of what we consider to be an INTP. Or someone who's like, you know, they're a research scientist and they're very theoretical and they're very, very brainy, thinky, and they do not seem to manifest a priority on values or emotions, okay? So that would be a case of what you would call falsification. What does CC do in this case? So from what I understood from some exchanges I had with Auburn, what it does is that it takes into account that there is an outlier, and it goes towards, it ends up being of statistical significance. In other words, the theory would say something like, if you are of this type, so FISC, for example, you are like, you know, X% likely to have this kind of psychology. And if you have outliers that multiply, then the percentages in terms of like assessing the likelihood are diminished. So from this perspective, I can see how this could work, but I think there's a slight danger when it comes to, because the psychology seems to me to be slightly underdeveloped or underdefined in CT, I think there might be a risk, at least something to be aware of, that the psychology of the person, which seems to falsify the theory, okay, and to make the percentage drop in terms of the correlation. If the psychology is relatively vague, it allows this voltologist, the theorist, to fall more readily for the temptation to reinterpret the psychology in terms that are actually suited to FISC in this case. In other words, what seems to be falsifying, and actually is falsifying the theory, will be susceptible to be interpreted in such a way as to not seem like it's falsifying it. The only way you can avoid it is by having very precise, rigorous categories for different types of psychology. So you see how the two connect together. And my final area of improvements, which I've mentioned before, so I'm not going to go into it, is it is not quite as publicly visible as it could be. And, you know, if someone within the CT team could recruit, I'm not talking about myself, of course, but, you know, an expert marketer who happens to be also someone who is very legitimately interested in the theory. I mean, that could be good, but it's also a question to ask to the CT people, is that how much publicity do they want? And are they perhaps at a certain level happy to be in this more niche domain of the already niche typology community? I'm going to stop here because it's been half an hour. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. If you've had the courage to watch the video so far, please let me know what you think in the comments, and let's have a discussion. It's a very good theory. It's a very interesting theory. It's the most exciting theory, I think, out there at the moment. So let's try to give it as much publicity as it deserves. Ciao.